Hi, everybody. Welcome to another edition of Psychology from My Kitchen. I'm Mrs. Ryan, and in today's episode, we are wrapping up Unit 3, Biological Basis of Behavior, with our last aspects of the brain, and that is talking about language. So we know that we have two hemispheres to our brain, and that there is the line that goes down the middle between the two hemispheres known as a longitudinal fissure, and that these two hemispheres are going to communicate with one another with a band of neural fibers called the corpus callosum. And while the majority of our body is actually relatively symmetrical, right? The two eyes, the two nostrils, the two ears, the limbs, that it would make sense that the brain then is also symmetrical because I have these two hemispheres and I have, two sides of my brain and so on. But we actually have learned from a very early point that the brain is asymmetrical, and that while our brain does have two halves, and that we have the two hemispheres, and that we have the four lobes in each hemisphere of the cerebral cortex is not made equal to one another, and that certain parts of the cerebral cortex actually have different jobs from the left side to the right side. And one of the ways that we know that we have a dominant side to our brain tends to go with handedness. Now, somewhere around 90% of the worldwide population is right-handed, where the other 10% is either left-handed or can be ambidextrous, in which there doesn't really appear to be a dominant hand. Most children in their toddler to preschool years really start to demonstrate a preferred hand that they use, whether that be for holding like an eating utensil, or if they start coloring pictures and things like that, they start to demonstrate a preferred handedness. And the fact that we have a dominant hand, and in fact you have a dominant foot typically, and they do not have to be the same dominance, it just demonstrates to us that we probably have one side of our brain that is doing more. You've also probably heard about people who are right-handed, might be more logical thinkers, or that they have more language abilities or something like that, whereas people who are left-handed might be seen as more creative, more artistic, more mathematically inclined. And there is some anecdotal evidence that, that can in fact happen, but it's a little bit more complicated than just what hand is dominant. It actually has more to do with the setup of your brain. And the way that we really see that is with language. For the majority of people, the parts of your brain that are devoted to language are on the left side of the brain. And so if they are on the left side of the brain, that would explain why so many people would have a dominance for the right hand. Because of course we know that in the brainstem there is that crossover point where one half of my body is controlled by the opposite half of my brain. So language is, for human beings, one of the most dominant and important things that we can do, that we have the ability to communicate with one another. When we do research on victims who've experienced different types of brain damage, that it is the language aspect that tries to work the hardest, even more so than other types of physical movements like being able to walk, for example, that it is language that is so much more important to us to communicate and to be connected to one another. So we're going to talk today about two major areas of language capabilities that are both named after the psychologists who discovered them, and that is the Broca's area and Wernicke's area. Notice it's not Wernicke because we have another German on our hands, the Wernicke's area. So anytime that a person experiences a problem with language, they experience what is known as an aphasia. And aphasia is simply referring to this impaired use of language that may be where I can speak, but I can't read. I can understand something, but I can't speak. I might be able to write, but I can't read. I could read, but not write. I could read, but not speak. There's all kinds of different combinations going on here with my language. And when this is impaired, we refer to it as an aphasia. And the aphasia typically happens because there has been damage specifically to Broca's area or Wernicke's area. So Broca's area is typically in the left frontal lobe. So if you look in my diagram here, you'll see the motor cortex is identified in that purple kind of strip, and that would be at the end of the frontal lobe. And that Broca's area is that bluish kind of color that sits immediately in front of it. And so we would find that in the left frontal lobe. And Broca's area is responsible for language expression, so being able to express your language. And for human beings, there's two major ways that we express language. That is by speaking and by writing. And there is difference between the physical act of writing and making letters and characters and things like that versus typing, because typing is not as, what's the word that I want to use? It's not as challenging to type something as it is to handwrite something. And that's why overwhelmingly research demonstrates to us that when we physically write something, we are much more likely to remember it even if we were to type it. And that has to do with the areas of the brain that are utilized here with Broca's area. So with Broca's area, left frontal lobe, right in front of the motor cortex, because, well, in order to express my language, I got to be able to move something. I got to be able to move my mouth. I got to be able to move my hand. And so Broca's area is responsible for that. If you were to have a Broca's aphasia, you would have a problem with expressing your language. And for some people, this might mean that they are unable to write something or that they are unable to speak about something. In fact, at the high school that I work at in Sylvania, Ohio, years and years ago, there was a cheerleader who was dropped during a stunt and she hit her head. And when she hit her head, she was unable to speak for several weeks. And then all of a sudden it came back, and then it went away again, and then it came back permanently. She experienced what's known as a Broca's aphasia. Now, the other area that is devoted to language is Wernicke's area. And Wernicke's area is typically found in the left temporal lobe. And Wernicke's area is responsible in some ways for language expression, but much more so for language comprehension. It is for the language understanding. And the major ways that we understand language is by hearing it and by reading it. That is the majority of ways that we're going to understand or to comprehend what kind of language it is that we are experiencing. And so again, temporal lobe. That makes a lot of sense because what else do we know about the temporal lobe? Well, that's where my primary auditory cortex is located. That's where I hear stuff. And so you can see that this area of the brain meshes together with Wernicke's area in order to allow us to comprehend language. Now, as a high school teacher and as a social studies teacher, I don't do a whole lot of popcorn reading. But I remember very clearly in my elementary school days and maybe even in my English class in high school that we would do popcorn reading. And in popcorn reading, it was, you call on somebody and they're supposed to read the passage, and the dreaded thing would happen, and that after you read this, like you're sitting there sweating, waiting for your turn, and then you get called on and you spit out what it is that you're supposed to say, and oh my gosh, then the teacher asks, and what does that mean? And you're like, I don't know. I just read it, but I have no idea what it means. Let me explain why that might have been so incredibly difficult for you. Because the actual act of reading out loud is super challenging with the number of areas of the brain that all of that information goes to. So if you're going to read something, that information has to go inside your eyes. Woohoo. It goes to the optic nerve all the way to the thalamus, and the thalamus says, hey, I'm looking at something. we need to send that to our primary visual cortex in the occipital lobe. So you can actually see this process right here in my diagram. We start occipital lobe, visual cortex right here in the back. Then next, I go to an area of the temporal lobe known as the angular gyrus. Now, not everybody's angular gyrus is as strong as we once thought, because what the angular gyrus does is it transforms visual information into an auditory code. This is where when you are reading something to yourself, you may have a voice inside of your head that is reading to you. So like sometimes when I read novels, for example, different characters kind of have different voices that I might almost hear. And once I get to know students really well, when I read their work, I sometimes read it hearing their voice as though they are speaking it to me. And that is the role of the angular gyrus. It's taken this visual information and transformed it into an auditory code that I can hear. From there, we go to Wernicke's area, where I'm going to comprehend what it is that I was just reading. I'm going to make sense out of what it was that I was just reading. But now, if I'm going to be then speaking something in response, like if I'm going to respond back to whatever a person's saying to me or something like that, now I got to send information to Broca's area, which sends information to my motor cortex, which sends information to my thalamus, which sends information down to the muscles of my face and tongue to actually make these words come out of my mouth. And that's a big, long process. So when you're sitting in class and you're doing popcorn reading, you're going so fast that you completely skip over the angular gyrus and Wernicke's area, where you're not really comprehending what it was that you just read out loud, because you didn't allow the time for that part of your brain to actually work. A lot of times we do better with reading comprehension if we can be silent in our reading, or if we can read to ourselves. So sometimes, like when students are taking a test, for example, and they're reading the question kind of to themselves in this kind of whisper, that actually is kind of beneficial, because you're manipulating that hearing aspect that Wernicke's area is really picking up on, that comprehension that you need. And so this is the process by which we experience language. Very complex, set up in virtually all people, that all people have the capacity for language if they have these areas of the brain. And brain plasticity can play a role here as well, in that should the brain become damaged, especially at a young child where like the left hemisphere is damaged, where they would have had that language capability, the brain is able to reorganize itself to give people language, because language is such a dominant characteristic that we need to have in our brain. So until next time, I hope you all have a great day. Thanks for joining me.